Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. Let's be honest, few people could find Patagonia on a map. But that doesn't mean that few have heard of the term Patagonia and, of course, the place Patagonia. If you spent time online researching giants, you have in fact run into Patagonia. Since the early 16th century, reports of giant people from Patagonia were the rage in Europe. So let's find out what's true and what isn't with the Patagonian giants. At the very least, you'll learn some geography. Patagonia is the landmass that constitutes the southern region of Argentina. Reports of a giant race began with Antonio Pigafetta, an Italian scholar who accompanied Ferdinand Magellan on his trip to circumnavigate the globe. Pigafetta became Magellan's personal assistant and kept a detailed journal of the voyage. His journal was eventually published as a book, whose title in English was Magellan's Voyage, a narrative account of the first circumnavigation. In one entry in 1520, when Magellan's ship was near modern Puerto San Julian, Argentina, Pigafetta wrote, quote, "One day, without anyone expecting it, we saw a giant who was on the shore, quite naked, and who danced and leaped and sang. And while he sang, he threw sand and dust on his head. Our captain sent one of his men toward him, charging him to leap and sing like the other, in order to reassure him, to show him friendship, which he did. Immediately the man of the ship, dancing, led this giant to a small island where the captain awaited him. And when he was before us, he began to marvel and to be afraid, and he raised one finger upward, believing that we came from heaven. And he was so tall that the tallest of us only came up to his waist. Withal, he was well proportioned. The captain named the people of this sort Patagoni." Unquote. Now, Magellan's description of the people as Patagoni became the name for the region. The Spanish term Patagon was subsequently thought to mean big feet, but that's really a folk etymology. Pigafetta estimated the height of the giant to be around 8 feet tall. Other giants, including women, joined the first giant, including other women and children, and they joined one after the other soon thereafter. Unfortunately, Magellan couldn't resist the temptation to take specimens of the giants back to Spain. He and his crew tricked 2 giants onto the ship, but unfortunately they didn't survive very long on the ship, and they never made it back to the mainland. And not surprisingly, other explorers following Magellan years later also reported seeing giants in the same region. Austin Whittall, who blogs on Patagonian history, chronicles various reports from the 16th through the 19th centuries. And you can see our episode website for lots of examples. I'm just going to give you a few. First, the giants were mentioned when the Patagonian coast was visited in 1577 by English Admiral Sir Francis Drake. Upon returning to England, Drake's chaplain, Francis Fletcher, wrote about seeing, quote, "men in height and greatness that are so extraordinary that they hold no comparison with any of the sons of men this day in the world," unquote. Now, Fletcher quantified their height later at about 7 to 7.5 feet. Sometime afterward, Drake's voyage troubled the Spaniards, and in 1579, the Viceroy of Peru sent Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa to settle the Strait of Magellan to avert the possibility of the English occupying the region. Sarmiento's written account tells us that the natives, quote, "were big people, giants." He also reported their great strength as it took 10 of his men to capture one of the natives. Thirdly, in 1591, Anthony Knivet, an adventurer who had sailed with Cavendish, wrote a vivid book about his voyages around the world that mentions a Patagonian youth about, quote, 13 spans tall, unquote. In other words, about 9 feet tall. Fourthly, Dutch captain Sebald de Weert while sailing through the Strait of Magellan in 1599, reported seeing, quote, savages whom he thought to be 10 or 11 feet high, unquote. Now, as you can imagine, all of these reports created a sensation in Europe. Explorer reports continued through the 17th and well into the 18th centuries. The reports gave rise to artistic interpretations of the giants, some with Europeans for scale. All of them showed inordinate height for the giants. However, and this is important, no physical evidence was ever produced or brought back for the height figures. But even more problematic were the reports from travelers to Patagonia that didn't conform to the sensational reports we just talked about. In 1628, the first detailed account of Sir Francis Drake's voyages was published. It was called The World Encompassed. The author was Sir Francis Drake's nephew of the same name. His accounting was markedly different than these reports of the earlier century, and was particularly critical of Magellan. He wrote, Magellan was not altogether deceived in naming them giants, for they generally differ from the common sort of men, both in stature, bigness, and strength of body, as also in the hideousness of their voice. But yet they are nothing so monstrous or giant-like as they were reported. The Spaniards did not think that ever any English man would come thither to reprove them, and thereupon might presume the more boldly to lie. The name Patagones, 5 cubits, namely 7.5 feet tall, describing the full height, if not somewhat more, of the highest of them. Now, what Drake just said there is significant. He is recording this older report, really chronicling an older set of circumstances in great detail and contradicting not only Magellan's report earlier, but those episodes, those explorations that followed Magellan all the way up to about the year 1600. Drake reduced the height of the Patagonians from somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 feet to 7 to 7.5 feet. Now that was still quite a bit taller than the average European, which was just under 5.5 feet tall. He also accused the Spaniards directly of lying, thinking no one would ever go back and check upon what they had written. In the 1700s, Horace Walpole, an English historian and novelist, published an account of the giants lately discovered, subtitle, In a Letter to a Friend in the Country following the return in 1766 of Captain John Byron, who had circumnavigated the world in the HMS Dolphin. How's that for a book title? Walpole lampooned rumors that Byron and his crew had encountered giants of 9 feet in height. It turns out that Byron's own journal was on Walpole's side. The official account of Byron's journey by Hawkesworth was published in 1773 and clarified the encounters this way. Quote, When we came within a little distance from the shore, we saw, as near as I can guess, about 500 people, some on foot, but the greater part on horseback. One of them, who afterwards appeared to be a chief, came towards me. He was of a gigantic stature and seemed to realize the tales of monsters in a human shape. If I may judge his height by the proportion of his stature to my own, it could not be much less than 7 feet, unquote. Now, there were a host of later reports by explorers that confirmed the nephew Drake's book and this book on Byron's reports. The Patagonians were not, according to these detailed reports, 9 to 10 feet tall, but rather 6 to 7.5 feet tall. So what's the verdict with all this? Historians of the Patagonian giants note that there was never any physical evidence for the unusual giantism in Patagonia. In other words, giants over 8 feet tall. Subsequent reports of the same people group show that the earlier reports were exaggerations, but still on target in that Patagonia was home to a people group much taller than average Europeans. Work in the 19th and early 20th century that included measurements and photographs, in other words, not artistic interpretations, confirm that the tall Patagonians were like the very tall people of today, 7.5 feet. They were also the outliers. In other words, not all Patagonians were in fact that tall. So the verdict is that the Patagonian giants would be like tall people today. In earlier centuries, their height was more of an anomaly because the average height of a human being in those days was shorter than it is now. Modern scholars believe that these people were most likely the Tehuelche people who disappeared in the late 19th century. Thanks for watching this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Don't forget to visit our website for sources and resources on this episode and, of course, all of our other episodes as well. And please come back and watch again, because what you know may not be so.